Richard Johnson, and the topic is the potential impact of the Great Recession on future retirement income.
And so this is a little bit different from the presentation you just saw because we're focusing solely on recession, solely on the impact of high unemployment on future retirement incomes. We know that the recession was really bad, and that's why a lot of people are calling it the Great Recession. By many measures, it was the worst financial downturn since the Great Depression. It lasted 16 months, which was longer than any other downturn since the 1930s. And its effects are still being felt. So more than 3 years after the start of the recession, unemployment is still around 9%. GDP fell more rapidly in 2009 than it had in any year since 1938. We lost 8.8 million private sector jobs. Unemployment really surged over the course of the recession, the quickest increase in unemployment that we've seen since World War II. And long-term unemployment has really proliferated. So that in 2010, 43% of those who were out of work had been out of work for 6 or more months. Now, certain groups have been hit a lot harder than others. In particular, men hit harder than women, those with limited education, younger people, people of color. This chart shows male unemployment in 2010. The overall male unemployment rate was 10.5%, but these bars represent different age groups. You look at the youngest men there, 20 to 24, their unemployment rate was 17.8%. Look at young men who only had a high school diploma, their unemployment rate was more than a fifth. And look at African-American young men, 2024, who did not complete high school, fully half of them were unemployed in 2010. So the recession has really hurt a lot of people, as we've been hearing about. 3/4 of unemployed workers in 2010 said it had a major impact on their lives. For those who were unemployed for a substantial period of time, many of them had to dip into their savings. They had to borrow from family and friends. A substantial minority missed mortgage or rent payments. Even those who didn't lose their job were hurt because wages really stagnated during the recession. So that between the middle of 2008 and 2009 and the middle of 2009 and 2010, in each of those 12-month periods, the nominal wages, average nominal wages, increased only about 1.5%. And in the first of those years, real wage growth was actually 0. And so as a result, we're seeing wealth declining, as we just saw, not only because of the recession, but also because of the reduction in housing and equity values, and poverty has increased. So it's hurt working age people a lot. What might this mean for future retirement incomes? And it seems plausible that retirement incomes would fall because they're very dependent on lifetime earnings. So that as lifetime earnings fall, people are going to receive less Social Security, they're going to receive lower defined benefit pension plans. Both they and their employers are going to end up contributing less to defined contribution plans. People are going to have less money to put into other types of assets. But the relationship is kind of complicated because, for example, Social Security is progressive. Social Security only counts the first 35 years, the top 35 years of your lifetime earnings. And the availability of survivor and of spousal benefits further weakens the relationship between earnings and benefits. With pensions, some people don't have pensions, so they have nothing to lose. And we might think that, well, this is, maybe 2 years. Let's say you were hit really hard, you didn't work for 2 years, that's awful. But you average out over a 40-year career, maybe it just kind of washes out over a lifetime. What might be more important is the decline in the slowdown in wage growth. So that if this wage stagnation that we saw over the past 2 years, if after the recession ends, if after the labor market recovers, if wages don't catch up to where they were, wages could be lower for the rest of many of these workers' lives, and that could have a big impact. So we think then that the impacts are going to differ by age and education. As Julia mentioned, older workers might be hit more because they don't have time to recover, they don't have time to react, it's harder for them to save more perhaps, it's harder for them to keep working. For younger workers, once the economy recovers, they can work longer if they haven't, because the older people, if they lose their jobs, it's very hard to get back into the job market. For younger people, that's less of a problem, perhaps. They can save more, they have more time to save. But then if the real impact is through the wage, then for the younger people, this lower wage is going to affect them throughout their lives. For the older people, a lot of them have basically most of their careers are over, so the fact that wages are lowered won't have much effect. The less educated might be hit more because, as I just showed you, they're the ones who had the really high unemployment rates. On the other hand, they don't have a whole lot to lose, so it might not really have much impact. They would have been pretty. They wouldn't have done well even without the recession. So what we're going to do in this paper is we project retirement incomes for adults 25 to 64 in 2008, and then we're going to compare those incomes to what they would have received had the recession not occurred. I'll explain in a moment how we do that. We're going to focus on income at age 70 because we really want to look at people who are not working. So we're going to wait until age 70 when most people have stopped working and see how they're doing after their careers are over. One of important keep in mind when looking at age 70, though, is that some of the worst off people don't survive to age 70. And so this will perhaps understate the distributional effects. And then we want to compare outcomes for 10-year cohorts because we think that it's really going to matter how old you were when the recession hit. Another implication of this, though, is that for the oldest people, 55 to 64 in 2008, we're not projecting that far into the future. We're only projecting between 3 and 13 years. For the youngest people, we're projecting between 30 and 40 years, and of course it's hard to know what's going to happen. Even 10 years might be a rather heroic projection. 40 years is obviously more so. So what we use here is Dynasim 3. This is the Urban Institute's dynamic microsimulation model. It's something we've been working on for decades, and we update it periodically. It's been well vetted, and it starts with a sample from the 1990 to 1993 survey of income and program participation panels. And then there's hundreds of equations that model various life course processes, and we then age this data year by year, and it goes out to 2085. An important aspect of this is that because this model was primarily built to think about Social Security reform, a lot of things are aligned to the trustees' assumptions, and in particular, employment, earnings, and inflation. And so that means that we're somewhat dependent on what the Social Security trustees say, even though sometimes we don't necessarily agree with how they think, let's say, labor force participation is going to play out over the coming 30 years. But anyway, what we're going to use then is, as our baseline, we're using the 2010 assumptions. The Social Security trustees' assumptions for 2010 were released in August, so that August of 2010, that is well into the recession. We think it really reflects most of the impact of high unemployment on future outcomes. And the fact that it was released rather late, usually comes out in March or this year May, meant that this paper was a little bit delayed. But for our 2008, for the no recession scenario, we're going to use the 2008 trustees' assumptions. These were released in March of 2008. This is before the recession was really apparent, certainly before the recession had much impact on the labor market. And so we're going to compare projections under these two assumptions. There were other changes between the 2008 and 2010 assumptions that we had to adjust for. So what we really did was just isolate the impact of the recession. So for example, health reform had a big impact on the 2010 assumptions. We put those assumptions into the 2008 assumptions as well. So under both cases, we're seeing the impact of health reform. One final thing before we get to the results, and that is that our income measures assume that people annuitize 80% of their retirement accounts and other financial assets. So that when we're showing income numbers up here, they do account for some large DC balances. So what do we find? This chart shows the percent reduction due to the recession in various measures by our 4 different age groups. So the higher the bar, the bigger the reduction, the harder they were hit. So we look at average year's work, you see it really has very little effect. For all the age groups, it reduces average year's worked over the lifetime by less than 1%. But there's a big impact on lifetime earnings, and that's because we're assuming that that wages wage growth returns, but never makes up the wage growth that was lost during the recession. And so for the youngest people, it reduces their lifetime earnings by 4.8%. Much smaller effects for the older people because much of their careers are over. But we turn to Social Security benefits, and what we see there is that for the younger people, basically it has the same impact on Social Security as lifetime earnings. For the older people, it has a bigger impact on Social Security benefits, and that's because of the way Social Security benefits are computed. Benefits are tied to the average wage when you were age 60, so that if you turn 60 after 2008, your benefits would be substantially lower than had you turned 60 earlier. Or actually, a better way of saying it, it would be substantially lower than had the recession not occurred. Basically, because of this indexing factor, the recession is, in effect, reducing earnings in terms of Social Security for people's entire lives, not just those that happened after the recession. And so we see that for people 45 and older, Social Security benefits are falling a lot more than lifetime earnings. We put everything together, and what we find is that overall, the recession is going to have only a modest impact on household income at age 70, reduces it by about 4%, more for younger people, about 5%, than for people older than 35, for whom it's about 4%. There's some differences by where you are by your income quintile, where you are on the income distribution. I just want to point out one thing for 55 to 64-year-olds. What we see is that those in the bottom have a pretty small impact, only reduces their income by 1%. For those in the middle and the top of the income quintile, it has a bigger effect. What's driving, for the low-income people, it's just Social Security benefits. That's the only thing they're losing. But for people in the middle and the top, what's really falling is their earnings at age 70. These are people who aren't going to be able to work, let's say 5 years from now. We're just seeing that their labor force participation rates, their employment levels actually, have fallen a lot because those who lost their jobs aren't going to be able to work at age 70. Let me just go right to the conclusions. The Great Recession, then, we find will modestly reduce future retirement incomes, and it's mainly because of the slow wage growth. It's not the loss of a few years of work, or in some cases, just a few months of work. The absolute reductions are going to be greatest for the high socioeconomic status groups. That's a slide I didn't show you, but it stands to reason. Those are the ones who have the most to lose. That's in absolute terms. In terms of percentage, there really wasn't much difference across income or education levels. And what I think is an important caveat for all of this is that it's not clear that we're really fully modeling the impact, the long-term impact of being laid off. For example, we're assuming that there is some persistence built into this, that if you're laid off today, you're more likely to go back to work in the future. But this recession could be worse than what we've seen in previous recessions. We know long-term employment is a lot worse. So some of these people could end up being harmed a lot more than what our model is showing. So I think there is an important caveat. And finally, that adults in the late 50s during the recession are being hit hard, or will be hit hard. It's because of Social Security indexing. They're less likely to work in retirement. And I think because we're not projecting these results so far into the future, that these results maybe are more plausible, at least not quite as tentative as the results for young